This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm here with Marc Banjak, and Marc, I've known Marc for several years at this point. I believe we met at Magi a few years ago.
Correct, on the East Coast.
And for those of you who don't know, Magi is a clinical research conference, and used to be organized by Norm, and I believe it now belongs to someone else. But the point being, that's where we met. And so Marc, is your background? And sorry, I should add. And Marc is an attorney, and he works he worked in the context of clinical research agreements and a variety of other agreements like that. But now you are general counsel.
Yes. I got in the industry initially from the CRO space. So I started working at a fairly large international CRO a number of years ago.
Yeah.
And then went on to a medical device company, and then back to a CRO world, and now back in the pharma space, working as a general counsel.
So first of all, let's talk about that path of just going CRO back and forth, and then back into pharma in a general counsel role. Is it fair to say that you have a clinical research background and you've accumulated other skills along the way? What was that path like for you? Was that difficult? Was that is it always sort of chasing the newest thing, or have you always felt relatively comfortable? Because that's one of the questions everyone asks about general counsels, right? Like, there's too many things.
Right. And it's not the conventional path, I think, that I took. So typically, a lot of general counsels are from law firms, and go from law firms and then eventually get into the biotech or pharma background and then move up from there. I definitely took a different path. I did work in the CRO space, like I said, really learning about not only from a legal, contracts, everyday contracts, but also understanding the regulatory environment, understanding, what it means to be a local sponsor in a certain country. What does that mean? What are the obligations of that? Does that mean? Each country has something different, and that's, evolving over time. What does it mean, when you're purchasing a piece of equipment for a clinical site, what kind of issues do you have with that? A lot of sponsors, especially small ones, don't understand those intricacies and those rules. And so one thing that was really a huge gap in the CRO world is educating them on those issues. So we did that a lot, actually.
So you worked primarily in the CRO world. How did you develop, and we had a very brief discussion right before, and you talked about how you deal now with sales reps, which is not your typical perspective from a CRO background.
Right. Never had that experience before until I got to this role here. So commercial is a lot different role on the pharma side than the CRO, clinical research, the product development side. Yeah. You really have to understand, what does it mean ad promo? You have to understand what those rules are. You have to understand what a sales rep can do and can't do. What kind of, can they just buy lunch for somebody for no there has to be an educational purpose, right? So those kind of things you have to understand and try to understand what the business is trying to achieve, while at the same time balancing the risks associated with those activities.
So it was an educational experience for you. So how do you educate your sales reps? Do you do an annual compliance program? Do you have periodic programs? How do you decide if your sales reps need training right now? How does that work?
Sure. And everyone needs training every time. There isn't one particular time, right? But there is a set of training whenever a new sales rep comes on board. There is a set of training that they do get, not only on the product itself, but also compliance training.
Yeah.
So, anything from travel and expense policy, interactions with HCPs and HCOs, what reprints, if they want to provide reprints, what does that do? What can they do with those? There's a vast number of different things that they can and can't do, and you just need to educate them. There's never one particular time, and they always get, they always ask for additional assistance, actually.
Right.
Amazing, as long as you have a good relationship, our compliance team with the reps themselves, they will call us, individually and proactively call us about situations they have to make sure they're doing the right thing. I mean, most sales reps want to do the right thing. They're just trying to help the patients and trying to educate their physicians to understand what the product is.
And what have you found to be the biggest gap in knowledge when you're training a new sales rep that a more seasoned sales rep has figured out by now?
Sure. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is the interactions with the HCPs. And that is vastly different from a new sales rep, because this new sales rep thinks, I think a lot of people still have this old mentality of what a sales rep can do. You wine and dine people, and that kind of has gone out the door, 10 years ago already. But a lot of people have that mindset still, and they think they can still do it. And I think that's where the more seasoned sales rep understands that. They understand what they can't do. They understand what a speaker program is. They understand, the value of that and the education behind that. There's a lot of enforcement in that area now currently, and I think there's going to continue to be enforcement in that area. And what does that look like in 5 to 10 years? I think it's going to be a challenge, because the industry, at least from an enforcement perspective, is moving further and further away from them.
So you talk about the industry moving further and further away, and that reminds me of something like the pharma code or the bio code. I don't know whether your organization is part of it, but in your role as general counsel, I assume you have a say in whether it should be or shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I don't know, again, if you've even given a thought to this, but how do you decide whether that's a code you want to follow, or do you go, I want to follow the law because that's what's required?
Right. And so we're not a part of the organizations, but our code of conduct definitely exemplifies those principles. And I think that's what most of the industry does. They do look at those codes as a way of guidance, right? Mm-hmm. And as well as other organizations as well. Like Magi for the clinical research area, there a lot of those things are discussed there. Yeah. We belong to a group called Pharmaceutical Compliance Forum, where the industry is very heavily involved in, and you understand what other people are doing. You understand how other people are dealing with certain issues, whether it's, COVID, everything went virtual, right? How do you do a speaker program in a virtual environment? Right. How do you do an in-service that, during the middle of the day in a virtual environment? Those things are challenges that we really had to face the last, 8 to 12 months.
So it's interesting you talk about the last 8 to 12 months. One of the big continuing problems that we've always had, well, not always, but probably in the last 5 years or so, has been this idea that sales reps are slowly getting closed off from engaging with HCPs, with healthcare practitioners, in their offices or in academic medical centers. And in those scenarios, they're having to deal with this idea that sales is bad and I won't talk to you. So one of the things that I have seen a lot of companies do is sort of bone up on their marketing programs, and that's often involves social media.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit further about is your organization involved in social media? How are you constructing or conceiving or conceptualizing policies around it?
Yeah, sure. So this year we actually are looking to move into social media and that platform, as well as other digital media platforms. Currently, we're doing unbranded messaging from more of a corporate perspective on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
But we are looking to see what does it look like to do a branded messaging on, Facebook or other types of social media platforms. What does that look like? The other piece that we're looking into is patient ambassadors. Yeah. Is certain patients have now experience with our product, and what do they say about that experience, about their experience with not only the disease state, but their involvement with our product too.
So when you talk about social media and you talk about patient ambassadors, one of the key topics that comes up is this idea of social media influencers. Mm-hmm. And that has been a thing that the FDA has been looking at primarily in the context of tobacco, for tobacco, especially in the context of vaping. But they have looked at it in the context of pharma. A good example of that is the Kim Kardashian ad, if you will.
Yep.
So when you're talking about that, what kind of easy reminders would you give to people who are conceiving of a social media policy? And again, considerations, obviously not your policy or anything like that, but what are some considerations they should be thinking about? Because the organizations I work with, they talk about, oh, you know what, we need to create a appropriate social media policy. And it's just unbranded, no big deal. But what are your thoughts? How do you sort of deal with that?
So when we started moving into social media, we did create an overall arching just policy, very high end, just to get the kind of the basic rules. And then last year, when we started looking into doing more activity, we actually put together an SOP for the policy. But it was all unbranded. Now that we're moving to branded, we're now looking to create a new SOP for the branded side, actually. And what does that look like? And there's a lot of stakeholders that just need to be involved. It's not just marketing. It's not that just legal or compliance, but it's also, pharmacovigilance. They should be involved because they need to make sure that they know where this messaging is going. Same thing with the patient ambassadors. Is the patient ambassadors need to be trained, just like a sales rep needs to be trained, of what they can and can't do when it comes to speaking about the product or their disease what's related to the product. So again, all these different kind of groups have to come together and formulate some type of process or program together that makes sense for everyone. You have to balance the risk with the enforcement that you were talking about with Kardashian, as well as other areas too, and figure out where that balance is.
So you're talking about that balance, you're talking about different groups coming together, but one of the big questions we've dealt with in pharma for the last several years, because of, quite honestly, problems we have caused as an industry, is the idea of payment. And that's usually been a struggle in the context of HCPs, the context of healthcare practitioners. But I have seen, and I've been engaged in conversations about, how do you pay social media influencers and patient advocates? Have you had to wrestle with that yet or not yet?
We started looking into that, and what is fair market value for a patient, right? And it's challenging because there is nothing out there, and does it matter who that person is and what time, what their time is worth? I mean, that is the challenge. And especially in rare diseases, I think it's even more, what type of influencer do you want? What type of person do you want to be kind of the face of your, from a patient perspective, at least, of your product. And it's always challenging to figure out what that is and what that means. Again, even with HCPs, I think you just have to understand what other people are doing. You have to ask around. You have to see how other companies are dealing with it, because that is the market then. You have to understand what other people are doing in order to create that market, if you will. Because if you go way, you're paying $1,000 an hour for somebody that where everyone else is paying $100 an hour, then there's a little bit of a problem, right? And what are they actually doing? I think the other big challenge of like a patient ambassador program is understanding that what their role is. They might get to be glorified like they're this, they are going to be a sales rep, but that's not what they are, right? And so you have to really understand that these are just ordinary people. They're trying to do what's best, and they may not know what's best. So that's your job as the manufacturer, to educate them on that. I lost you, Darshan.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I have a siren going on outside. So I muted myself and came back on. So we have a question. As Janki Joshi says, as HCPs value transparency in education and increasingly avoid sales reps, will branded communication add value?
I think so, yes. And again, it's all based on the education, right? And to me, that is where the value is educating the sales reps, because it could be a new product. It could be a product in an existing area that they don't know anything about. That is where we are. We started in a space where there are other competitors that We're not the first to market, and educating them on our product and the benefits of the efficacy, benefits of the safety of the drug, and teaching that, because again, HCPs are just people, right? They're doing their clinical practice, and that is their primary purpose, and so getting them to talk to them about other ways that they can help their patient is I think very valuable.
Thank you. So let's take that to the next level, and we're talking about engaging with patients. Where do you find the patients?
That's going to be a challenge. I haven't talked to marketing too much about that, because you got to be careful. There are types of groups on Facebook and other places about our disease state, but you as the manufacturer, you have to be careful going on those, right? The purpose of those is not to find patient ambassadors. They have their own reason and et cetera, but it really comes down to talking to your HCPs. Do they have anyone that they think of from a patient perspective that wants to share their story, that wants to be helpful? Other areas are patient advocacy organizations that really push the advocacy of the disease that this patient is experiencing. A lot of times they know people that again want to share their experience with other people. And that's all this is. That's all a patient ambassador program is sharing their own experience and help educating other patients about their experience.
So you talk about finding the patients, for example, in the doctor's office. How do you deal with patient privacy as a concept? And how do you guys have a privacy policy yet? You do? Okay. So we
did. That was the one thing we just did actually this past say 5 months. Yeah.
And how did that play itself out? How did you guys conceive the meets and bounds? Because when I work with privacy policies, the first question is, what do you want it to cover? Because you could cover a lot, or you could go, this is a narrow issue. We're going to go start here.
Right. Well, we took it broad actually. So first of all, we looked at all the different information that we were collecting, first of all, which is challenging to do, to be honest. Like, it's amazing how much information you collect from different vendors, from different sources, and what you do with it. And so that was the big thing, is we just needed to narrow down, what data are we collecting and what are we actually doing with it.
Yeah.
And then once you do that, then you kind of form that policy around that. And talk about what are you going to do if there's a breach? What are you going to do where are you going to even put the data? What kind of controls you're going to put in place for that data?
Yeah.
So we talked about, and we with the assistance of a couple of vendors, we put together a policy. But going to your question about patient privacy that's where the HCP comes in, right? The HCP has to talk to that patient to see if this is something they want to do, and then allow the patient to come to us.
Right.
You don't go to the patient. And we definitely talked about that within our teams as well. And if the patient is coming to you, then again, they're okay with that privacy being disclosed.
Perfect. Marc, before I let you go, any last comments or questions or considerations that people probably haven't thought of as it relates to your job?
Wow. It's just every day is different. I think that's the beauty of being in this type of role and being in a smaller company is every day is different. You see the gamuts of issues and questions and you work with some really, really talented people. If it wasn't for the people I worked with, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing.
One last thing. We have one more question, if you don't mind answering.
Sure. Yeah.
Janki asks again, given that education is backed by clinical research, is there more value in engaging through medical affairs rather than through sales reps?
That's an interesting question, because during COVID, that was one of the bigger challenges, is engaging through medical affairs. What we saw with COVID is, just similar to the sales rep, is there was limited access. If you were not essential, you were not allowed to have that access, and that was even more challenging because there was less interaction. There's less questions being gone. How do I treat this patient? How do I treat that patient? What do I do in this situation? That typically medical affairs is involved in. So Yeah, I think there is more value. It's just, again, you have to understand access is a challenge. And because of access is a challenge, you got to figure out how to have those discussions in other ways. Yeah, I think there's other ways. And like I said, clinical research, medical affairs, and sales reps all educate in different ways. And that's where the value is.
I think you have to be careful personally, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I think you have to be careful about when medical affairs oversteps that line.
Oh yeah, they can't be sales reps for sure, right? There's a reason why they're an MSL instead of a sales rep.
Right.
And most definitely. And we do. I mean, we always educate our MSLs on that piece, and understand that line. I mean, that there is a clear line in there. So.
And what is your take? This is one of the at one of the conferences I went to. I had someone from medical affairs who told me that they were timing their meetings with physicians, so that the medical affairs person goes in first, the sales rep sits outside, medical affairs talks about everything, and the sales rep goes in. What's your perspective on something like that?
It's a challenging question, and the question we've had. It's not. You shouldn't try to use that MSL to get access for a sales rep. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, depending on what the questions are, and depending on who the physician or HCP wants to talk to, that could be appropriate in certain situations. Again, the way I usually talk to people about it is you have to allow the HCP dictate where they want to go with it.
Yeah.
And as long as it's the HCP asking the questions, and as long as the HCP asking to go to the sales rep, or asking in the reverse too, going to MSL, then that's what's important. It's when you try to influence that, how they want to talk or who they want to talk to, creates the challenges.
Very cool. Marc, if people want to reach out to you or find you, what's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, so I'm on there. That's the easiest way to find me, I guess. So.
Perfect. Thank you again, Marc. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Darshan. Take care.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or the show's website at darshantalks.com.